On today's World Insight with Tian, mail bombs and gun violence, days before the U.S. midterm elections, what's at stake? And in an era of geopolitics and huge funding holes, how will the world's development program serve people in need? Our interview with UNDP administrator. Welcome to World Insight with me, Tian. The program is coming to you live on CGTN. Americans will go to the polls next Tuesday, and things have not been peaceful so far. Last Saturday, one of the deadliest attacks in U.S. history struck a Pittsburgh synagogue. Earlier last week, over a dozen explosive devices were sent to politicians and media outlets critical of President Donald Trump. On Tuesday, Trump said he would end birthright citizenship. Meanwhile, two large caravans carrying Central American migrants are en route to the U.S. Before we discuss all of these issues, let's take a look at this.
The most radical immigration policy by Trump could be on the horizon. On Tuesday, the U.S. president said in an interview that he plans to use an executive order to end the rights of citizenship for U.S.-born babies whose parents are not in the country legally.
Now, how ridiculous. We're the only country in the world where a person comes in, has a baby, and the baby is essentially a citizen of the United States for 85 years with all of those benefits. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. And it has to end.
In fact, the U.S. is far from the only country that grants birthright citizenship. And whether Trump could revoke the constitutionally enshrined right is a subject of debate. The bold claim still shocked a nation that is all too familiar with the president's hardline anti-immigration policies. The Pentagon announced Monday that it would send up to 5,200 armed troops to the Mexican border to prepare for the arrival of caravans of migrants arriving from Central America. Attacks on Democrats and the media have been the constant theme of Trump's midterm campaign rhetoric. Earlier last week, a Trump supporter was believed to have sent dangerous pipe bombs to prominent Democrats and CNN. Trump condemned the act, but said that blaming him for inciting violence was unfair.
Because he was insane for a long time. Bernie Sanders had a fan who shot a very good friend of ours, Steve Scalise, and other people. He was a total maniac. Nobody puts his name in the headline, Bernie Sanders in the headline.
Last Saturday, a gunman opened fire and killed 11 worshippers in a synagogue in Pittsburgh. The alleged murderer was not a Trump supporter, but reportedly believed that the migrant caravan was a Jewish plot against America. The massacre is thought to be the worst anti-Semitic attack in U.S. history. And protests against President Trump's condolence visit put America's deep divide on display.
For more on the U.S. midterm elections, we are joining in our Beijing studio Rick Dunham, co-director of the Global Business Journalism with Tsinghua University, also former Washington bureau chief of the Houston Chronicle. In Chicago, we have Laura Schwartz, a political commentator who worked at the White House during the Clinton era. And in Iowa City, Timothy Hagel, professor of political science at the University of Iowa. Welcome to our program, ladies and gentlemen. This is a gold team in a way. I remember all of you joined me during the discussions leading up to the presidential election. Wow, how time flies. So let me go to you, Ms. Schwartz. This is a very different time we're talking about right now. And what do you make of the possible result of midterm election? Of course, we understand you're coming from the Democrat perspective.
Well, you know, it's very interesting. Here we are just nearly 2 years later. And I think when you look back and see how Donald Trump was doing and how he did what he did versus now, you're seeing two different things. At the closing of the 2016 elections, Donald Trump stopped tweeting so much. He took the advice from his colleagues. He was trying to talk more about economics and policy and Washington, D.C.'s structure as a whole, and he won. Here we are, less than a week out from the midterm elections 2 years later. He's making it all about himself. He's making it about wedge issues. He's making it about rising up his base. And I just don't think that when he talks about himself, he wins. If he would pivot to the economy and some very strong points there, I think he'd much better be serving not just himself, but the party as a whole. So I just don't see this as the winning strategy for what he needs to accomplish with these Republicans.
Right.
Coming up in less than a week. I think he needs to shift it.
He himself is a label. He himself, he believes, is the way for the Republicans, at least from his perspective, to get to success. But Professor Hagel, from your perspective, what is going to be the focal point for this election? Is it going to be citizenship? Is it going to be the U.S. trade? Is it going to be the economy? Is it going to be social issues? What do you make of the most critical ones now?
Well, it's always hard to say what's the most critical issue, and as you've indicated, there are a host of issues that are on the table, so to speak. As far as the bases are concerned, for the Democrats and for the Republicans, that's really where a lot of the messaging is going, and particularly for that of Trump to try to get people to turn out, because of course, as we know, that there's often a bit of a drop-off in turnout in midterm elections as compared to presidential years. But the thing is that it's always those middle voters, and they often don't get caught up in some of the political stuff that goes on among the bases and what fires up the base. They're the ones that care more about the economy, health care, jobs, things of that nature, and so that's where that kind of messaging would resonate more with them. And so the question really is, and since they also have a more of a drop-off in turnout, the question is what message needs to get them to the polls, and then of course who they vote for when they get there.
Right. Mr. Johnson, what about the economy? Of course, that has been the slogan coming from the election for Mr. Clinton, but for now, when the economy is growing at 3.5% for the U.S. economy, that is really impressive. Whether that should be contributed to Mr. Trump or not, that's another question. But will that be the focal point, you think, right now for the election?
It looks like it's not the focal point at all, and I think you're absolutely right. If Donald Trump and the Republicans had run a disciplined campaign this year, a positive campaign, they would have talked about their accomplishments with the economy and the growth in the economy and the growth of business. But it just hasn't worked. It hasn't worked because Donald Trump has made the campaign about himself, and because the tax cut that the Republicans thought would be such a big deal is cutting against them, because people see that corporations got a huge tax decrease. Wealthy people got a huge tax decrease, but average people don't feel that they're making any more. And so the tax cut, which should be something that could benefit Trump, isn't working either. So I think it's a lost opportunity for Republicans.
On the other hand, Professor Hagel, the deficit issue is also one, even though you don't see ordinary Americans every day talk about deficit, but still it's going to be one of those issues likely to increase to $1 trillion by the year 2020. Even though there's trade war going on, deficit is not decreasing, but rather increasing 17%. So will these numbers at least get to the ears of those intellectuals that are, you know, in the middle between the two camps, now helping them to make a decision? Or this is not relevant at all?
I wouldn't say it's not relevant at all, but for, again, especially the middle voters, it's something that they probably don't care that much about it. That in terms of the Republicans, they often have talked about the deficit and concern with primarily spending, and of course the deficit related to that. But with Trump in office, it seems to be that that hasn't been as much of an issue, especially in terms of the grassroots part of the base, the Republican base. And as I said, for the middle voters, they just really aren't as concerned about it. They're more concerned with some of those tabletop kitchen type issues over jobs, the economy, health care, things of that nature.
Ms. Roth?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. You know, the deficit just isn't exciting for many people, but the announcement today that's going to hit nearly $1.3 trillion by 2020 is a major deal, because we're seeing some destabilizing factors in our markets in the United States as companies have had their third quarter earnings recently. We saw a big dip last week because, for example, a large company like Caterpillar, dealing with the tariffs and the trade war, it's getting more expensive for them, and they had a much lower earnings than expected. With the deficit as it is, I think people will have to, and not right now, but in the next 6 months, 10 months, 12 months, they'll start seeing that, whoa, all of these issues weigh economically, and all of that weighs into how much we pay for goods and services at the store. We haven't hit that point yet, so I don't think it's on top of mind. I think what's pivoting more towards to those issues on the table is fighting to take away the coverage of pre-existing conditions with which the Republicans are moving forward with, as well as cutting benefits and payouts from Medicare and Social Security for those over 65 to pay for all of these things that have run up the debt. I think that's going to really come into light in the next 6 months, but right now people are not seeing the immediate effects, so it's not as much on their mind.
There are a lot of things, Professor Hagel, if you think about it, both on the domestic front, I mean in terms of the United States, and on the international policy front, that it seems that the current administration is trying to frame it so that it could relate to the midterm election. But at the end of the day, people are going to ask those questions. How much of those are very temporary, are rhetorical? How much of those will be likely to become real policies? That debate, I guess, is also relevant leading up to the midterm election. Professor Hagel, what do you think? I mean, on the one hand, you have the citizen right thing going on, you have the immigrant thing going on the border, you have the trade war with China, you also have the U.S. having very different views about the Iran nuclear deal, but at the same time looking very positive to DPRK, also on the nuclear issue. And also about Russia as well, what to do with NATO. All of these are mixed, and many wonder how much of them are all shaped about midterm election. How much of those rhetorics will become reality? The world is watching. Professor Hagel, your thought here.
Well, you just again ran down this whole list of issues, and it's one of those things where they can't all sort of have equal time in terms of what the voters in the midterms are particularly concerned about. Now, again, there are important issues, and certainly ones that we've seen sort of pop up in the news, but that's part of the problem, is that we really don't seem to be able to focus on any given issue for any extended length of time, or at least a sufficient amount of time to actually think about the problem, do something, work out some solutions, and maybe implement them. That they sort of pop up and there's this thing for a day or two and then it's gone. And so all of these things are certainly important, and they all have to be addressed at some point or another, but it's perhaps too much for voters to really focus on in terms of saying, well, what's going to sort of determine my vote this particular time, or even am I going to vote? And that's why I say is that a lot of voters, and particularly a lot of the voters in the middle, they just aren't paying as close attention to a lot of these things. They're certainly aware of them,
right,
but that's not the thing that's going to drive them to the polls and get them to vote for one candidate or another.
Mr. Dunham, one after another, every day you got things going on in the morning when you look at the news. So what would this mean eventually for the voters' decision? Are they going to focus, or they are not necessarily so, and therefore they're not going to be in any way influenced by some of the current issues going on?
Well, that's a good point. I think first there's a lot of fatigue in America, election fatigue this season, because every morning you wake up and Donald Trump has tweeted something extraordinary that focuses all of social media attention for the next few hours, and then we move on to the next big thing. I think there's also a lot of anger. I think both bases are really charged up. Donald Trump's core, which may be about 25–30% of the electorate, is charged up. Democrats, it's probably about 45%, 40–45%, is charged up to go out and defeat Donald Trump by voting against any Republican they can find. And I think a lot of voters in the middle are really tired of this. That ranges from moderate Republicans to suburban independents. And right now, I think what suburban women in America do will determine who controls Congress in the next session.
Well, the voters are tired. There is a fatigue about the election, but many wonder, Ms. Schwartz, isn't that what some people really want? With this fatigue, with voters being quote-unquote disappointed, will issues still be important at all, or it's only the emotions?
I feel like this midterm is more on the emotions, Tian, versus the policies. You see polling every week. Well, we know where polling got the Trump and Hillary campaigns in 2016. None of them were quite right. I've been calling friends of mine that are very much either lean Republican or are Republican or independents in pockets of Florida, in Utah, in California, Wisconsin, where I'm from. And I've just been asking them, what's going to motivate you to go vote and to get your kids that are becoming of age to vote? Because it's that new generation of voters that haven't been turning out. And they said, you know what, for me, it's the rhetoric. I can't stand it anymore. Things that I want to be talked about aren't being talked about or moved upon, or they're being talked about and nothing happens. And they're simply going to vote, they're going to go vote, because they're motivated to vote, but it's the nasty rhetoric that's getting them out there, because they're like, enough with this. I don't want to go through this every day. Things haven't been getting done over the last 2 years, and I think that's what's motivating them to go vote, and I think that's why the Democrats, if they can just keep a positive message for these next couple of days, stay away from talking about impeachment, and keep with saying, you know, I want to make the economy work for you. I want to make sure that you retain your health care. I think that that would work. I really do. People are just tired of the rhetoric.
Well, that is one thing, isn't it? I mean, what is going to be motivating people to go out there and vote for whom as a result? But the other thing that is even more important for the rest of the world is watching. It's because this election is going to have a big impact, to say the least, ladies and gentlemen, on how the world is likely to be for the next 2 or even 4 years. This is not just about the U.S. midterm election. It's about how the U.S. domestic politics will spill over to the rest of the world. We've seen that over the past 2 years already extremely vividly. And therefore, Mr. Dunham, you are here in China for several years already. You see the trade war going on between China and the United States. Arguably, something has to do also with the midterm election, even though it's not limited to it. Mr. Dunham, how will this midterm election, the result of it, make any difference at all to some of the biggest branch of the issues in the world?
I think
geopolitics,
the
economy,
impact,
and you also got how the U.S. is going to be the leader or not for the next few years of the world. So, Mr. Dunham, your judgment here.
I mean, I think the biggest impact of this election is whether there is a check on Donald Trump's power. If Donald Trump views it as a success, if Republicans keep control of the House, keep control of the Senate, I think he will be unleashed. I think he will feel additionally confident to take on China, to take on Iran. If the Democrats take the House, and we're not going to predict the Senate today, but if they take either body of Congress, I think it will be a check on his power. The executive can do a lot. He can send troops to the border. He can do everything that he's done with China and the trade war. But I think that he will be somewhat limited politically if the Republicans lose at least one body of Congress. But I think the world is basically watching Trump's reaction to this election. And there's a lot of the world's wondering, is America a reliable partner? And if Trump is unleashed after this election, I think that the damage could be long-lasting to American relations with Europe as well as all over Asia. Well,
the world will have to digest whatever is going on inside the United States, Ms. Schwartz, but on issues such as China-U.S. trade war, many wonder, is it just a Donald Trump, or rather it is the Republican parties and so-called a common consensus among some of the most influential groups in the country that has reached a certain kinds of deal to deal with China, or at least a way to deal with China. So what Mr. Dunham earlier put it, to label it as a Donald Trump thing, is it really so? Will this midterm election be a dividing or defining factor of things?
Well, and the professor and Rick put it very well already as experts on China and trade policy. But I have to say, when you look at that relinquishing of checks and balances that we've seen over the last year and a half. And this recent downturn in the market attributed to the actual trade war and tariff war with China, I think the Democrats, if they got hold of the House of Congress, would put forth other legislation to curb the amount of tariffs we're able to do without congressional approval. And that's something that we will see once they take control, if that happens, how they can rein him in, because it does have reverberations. And I think the Americans are just, just the general voting public are starting to see that. Republicans have been really psyched about Donald Trump in office to get all their federal judicial appointments. Much more conservative judges on the bench, both in the circuit court, states and federally, and of course the Supreme Court, where you just saw the big Kavanaugh cases. He was seated on the Supreme Court. I think they've made a lot of trades and said, okay, we're not going to fight you on this if we get a judge on that. I think that would even out if at least one body went Democratic.
Professor Hagel, your feelings about this issue?
Well, right now it seems that most likely that the Democrats would take control of the House, but Republicans would maintain control of the Senate. So that's pretty much going to make it very, very difficult to get any kind of legislation through and onto President Trump's desk. That really isn't going to be a huge check on President Trump, because as we saw, particularly under President Obama, that the president has a lot of power and can issue executive orders, which undoubtedly with Trump would probably be challenged in courts. So there is that aspect to it. But of course, in terms of trade policies, if you're talking about treaties of one sort or another, it's still the Senate that gets to approve those rather than the House. And if the Republicans still control the Senate, that Trump would probably be able to get his treaties through, whatever they happen to be, but also in terms of, as was indicated, the judges, through that's whether it's Court of Appeals judges or the potential of any additional vacancies on the Supreme Court, that's an important thing for Republicans in general to keep the base happy. So it's hard to say how much, if any, Trump would actually be checked, even if Democrats take control of the House. But again, at least it's something where less legislation would get through in terms of Trump's agenda.
At this point, after a whole laundry list of incidents over the past few weeks alone, whether it's domestic or international, concerning the United States, many wonder, Mr. Dunham, whether this election will be a peaceful one, and many concerned about the potential, shall I say, chaos of various degrees related to the midterm election. Are you?
I'm really shocked by what's happened over the past week in America. This sounds like an election in India. It doesn't sound like an election in the United States. And Donald Trump has predicted violence if the Democrats take control of the House of Representatives. I really hope that doesn't happen. What we need is leaders in both parties right now to cool the rhetoric. But I do think there's a possibility of continuing violence. I mean, just look at what has happened from angry, middle-aged white men over the last few weeks.
It's almost like a surreal movie. Very briefly from you, Mrs. Schwartz.
Yeah, Donald Trump is holding 11 rallies over the next 6 days for Republican candidates for office. We have yet to see what that rhetoric is going to be, and I think that could contribute to some violence on Election Day. I think the majority of Americans, though, truly want to exercise their right to vote and are very good people. I think it's also, though, we should not forget that there's been a lot of cyber attacks on our election both last time and predicted this time, and I really hope that the government behind the scenes is working hard to make sure that there is no interfering in the election when it comes to the counting of votes and cyber hacks within them.
We understand some European organizations monitoring the elections for the past 7 years also is inside the United States, but certain states will not allow these teams to work there. Having said that, though, final words from you also, Professor Hagel.
I guess I take a little bit more optimistic view of things, that I don't see that some of the violence we've seen with the alleged pipe bomber or the shootings in Pennsylvania, that really is directly connected to the election. I think that we'll have free and fair elections as we usually do, but that doesn't mean that we won't have other violent attacks of one sort or another. Whether that's attributable to rhetoric on one side or another is another question. Some of these people just seem to be mentally unbalanced, and there have to be ways to try to find them and help them in advance of their activities.
Timothy Hagel, Laura Schwartz, Rick Dunham, thank you so much. Our program will monitor very closely what's going on leading up to the midterm election in the United States and certainly on the election day. Thank you so much. Really enjoyed it. Thank you. Stay with us here on World Insight. Still to come on the program. The UNDP sets out a mission of progress, a one-on-one interview with the administrator, Achim Steiner, on the milestones and the challenges of the UN and the UNDP right after this break. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight. I'm Tian. This year marks the 40th anniversary of China's reform and opening up. In the past 4 decades, China buckled down to work and managed to become the world's second largest economy. The United Nations Development Program, also known as UNDP, has lent a hand to China with a long history of collaboration. 39 years already. The UNDP has supported China through advisory and funding services, especially when China was just starting out. Recently, I sat down with Achim Steiner, the administrator of UNDP. He himself witnessed great challenges taking place in China over the past few years, and certainly the progress as well. In today's interview, he will talk about the milestones and the lessons from China's experience. Achim, as a close observer of China, what do you make of the real thing China has made it over the past 40 years?
What we in the world often see through the lens of economics is, however, far more. Yes, GDP has grown many times. People have become wealthier in terms of income per capita and households. But really the transformation of China is also one of urbanization, industrialization, maintaining a development pathway that also looked at urban and rural economy. I think from the beginning the desire, the commitment to not allow rapid development only to benefit the few, but to be inclusive, was part of the design. So the extraordinary number of people who were moved out of poverty and extreme poverty is part of that story.
China does not want to be the one that's saying, oh, you just follow me and then you will do as well as I do. And China didn't want either to say, well, I had some rich experiences, but I just don't feel like sharing with you guys. But that is a very delicate balance in a way.
You see, part of the role and the mandate of UNDP is to connect development experiences. So we have obviously been invited into China in 1979 to help inform Chinese decision-making about development. Today, we are increasingly also drawing on China's own modernization concepts, just like we brought sometimes China into contact with, for instance, the concept of special economic zones in the 1980s, 1990s. Over many years, China has been drawing on international lessons learned, using it to design its domestic policies. Today, the China Council is also a platform for the world to draw on China's own experience. And I think, as you point out, no country should assume that its own development model is automatically applicable to another nation. Culture, history, geography, all of these influence national decision-making. But we don't have to reinvent the wheel all the time, and that is what good development, networking and learning is all about. Take the best of what others have found, adapt it to your own context, and find a national way to inform development choices.
And now we talk about anti-poverty. Of course, the poverty issue you see developing countries, emerging economy, even developed ones are facing right now. China has been doing with quite a successful record, one of a kind almost. But the question is, what's next? There are still a huge chunk, if you look at the peer number of it, of poverty in this country, despite of rapid development elsewhere in the country. And meanwhile, you also see that because of the national goal, being set to alleviate poverty, there has to be not only a short-term achieving the goal, but also a long-term sustainable way of making sure the goal will forever be fulfilled. Thirdly, Achim, you know that while the country's wealth standards are raising, the poverty line is also raising. So there's always a goal of doing better. So you got a lot of layers of issues piled up. What about that?
I think you point to a very interesting issue, which is when we talk about development, sometimes economists have a way of defining a certain line that you cross, and then you are developed. Per capita income.
It's very automatic, mechanical even.
Exactly, which it is not. Development is about a constant set of choices and decisions that shape the future of our society. And so you never stop development, and you also want to particularly guard against falling back. And let me just give you 3 very brief examples that speak to that. In our experience, poverty eradication has indeed in China been extraordinarily successful, in many other countries also. India just now in the last 10 years has managed to lift over 270 million people out of extreme poverty. So this is a tremendous breakthrough. But what we learn is that 40% of people who escape poverty fall back into poverty. This is one of the very troubling statistics. Often, for example, by the absence of a health insurance system, because a crisis in health can cause you to lose up all your savings, which you will always do to protect your father, your mother. So we need to look also at poverty eradication as not only an income issue, but also establishing health protective schemes so that people are protected from actually falling back into poverty. Development is about a constant set of choices. It's a dynamic process, and sometimes it may be the unexpected that will cause major disaster. Last year's hurricane season in the Caribbean destroyed in some island nations the entire infrastructure. Basically, the country was destroyed overnight, and you have to rebuild. So these are the challenges of a constantly evolving development arena in which simple indicators are only pointers, but they're never the full reality.
How should we understand this debate about so-called definitions of developing country vis-a-vis emerging economies, vis-a-vis developed economies? How should we make sure they are not going to hinder us from doing the real work?
You point to something that is, I think, increasingly troubling all of us in a world where simplistic indicators
labels
and labels that come with it also, and groupings and interest groups that form around them do not necessarily match reality, both in terms of what has changed and also what it implies. I mean, if you take China 40 years ago, in terms of its total GDP, was smaller than the Netherlands, and today it is the 2nd largest economy. Clearly, the China of today is not the China of yesterday. We are not trying to use indicators and statistics to differentiate alone. We're actually trying to find a fair means of cooperation. Much of what the United Nations does and much of what our multilateral system does is provide the basis around which countries with different interests, different histories, different development status can come together to cooperate. And I think in UNDP, to me, this is one of the guiding principles. In the year 2018, we don't need to look at the world only in terms of per capita GDP. Some of the greatest threats in terms of, for instance, health, pandemics, climate change, extreme natural disasters, perhaps poverty and the associated emergence of extremism are actually happening in middle-income countries. The largest number of the world's poor do not live in LDCs, least developed countries, but in the middle-income countries of this world. So our role as the Development Programme of the United Nations is to be a partner in assisting these countries, advising them, supporting them in how to manage these transitions.
The drastic changes in geopolitics are complicating the agenda of the UNDP. Such change is exemplified by cases such as the 7-year-long Syrian conflict, a regional conflict that has evolved into a clash between the US and Russia. Also, the South China Sea issue that has raised tensions among China, the US, and various Southeast Asian states, the re-emergence of right-wing politics in South America, and the fracture of the European Union, and so on. In this context, the UNDP must find a way to carry out its mission while protecting its independence.
When you think about the United Nations Development Program, many of the current issues that it needs to deal with also need a very united international community. Unfortunately, these days, you see some countries' priorities are moving away from the global priorities, and yet these countries could be termed, quote-unquote, significant. So, from your perspective, could that be the reality for the future, or probably even more as we go?
We need to distinguish between understanding the driving forces of what is happening in individual countries right now, which are the product of a complex set of developments. Sometimes the disappointment with what was promised and was not delivered. The sense of a loss of sovereignty, perhaps, over your local life. The extreme inequality in wealth that is creating in a society a sense of unfairness, perhaps weaknesses in political leadership. So in each country these come together and they produce, clearly in many countries now, a degree of political polarization and even extremism that often translates into nationalism, inward-looking reactions. The question is, how can leaders both respond to these and at the same time not destroy the very fabric and the system that we have built up over many decades, a system that was born out in the sense of multilateralism, rules and norm-based cooperation. We have too much to lose right now to let those national tensions, in a sense, undermine our capacity to work together as nations. We have to always correct. We should not be complacent. Our international system has not delivered everything it promised. But at the same time, if the national perspective begins to be the driving and dominant one, I think we will undermine our capacity to not only work together as a community of nations and soon with 10 billion people, we will paralyze our capacity to deal with pandemics, with cybercrime, with extremism, with climate change, with migration. These are just a few examples of how we are destined to work together and to cooperate if we are to manage these challenges.
You see the changes of geopolitics these days. It is adding pressure to everything that we are working on and talking about. So how will UNDP, for example, doing development programs, be able to free yourself from the chains of geopolitics? I'm sure that is one question that you have to think about almost every day.
This is not the first time that we face a world with divisions. And I think the first departure point of multilateralism is always that it actually has been given a mandate. There are principles that govern us, and it is the community of nations that has established those principles. In the year 2015, in this remarkable moment, when the world in the General Assembly adopted the so-called 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals, it was almost against the politics of the day then, that people said, look, our future is predicated upon our capacity to work together. Development, sustainable development, is no longer an issue of the rich countries giving to the poor countries. We have a universal agenda. We can always compete in markets, we can compete with ideas, but we cannot compete against the future, against each other. And that is why the idea of multilateralism at this particular moment in time is not less relevant, as some would say. It may be more contested, but it actually is more important than if everybody was in agreement right now.
Related to that, about the funding for the SDG to be fulfilled, you got $1 trillion hole there. You think about all these important projects that are really having a huge impact on the individuals you are working with, and the enormous hole that you have over there about money. How to reconcile?
You rightly pointed, governments cannot finance these transitions alone, irrespective of whether you're a rich, developed country or developing nation. So a great deal of attention is now put onto private capital and private finance, because the world currently has about $300 trillion worth of wealth. Our role as UNDP is to help governments look at what kind of incentives do we create in the financial markets of tomorrow to attract private sector investment. It's not as if we are inventing this for the first time. Private sector has invested in healthcare, in power generation, in public transport systems, in water supply systems. So what we have to do is create an economy in which private capital can invest in the delivery and the impact of sustainable development goals while also making a return on investment. It's not to privatize our economy. I think this is the big lesson we learned in the 90s.
It's a different thing.
It's
a very different thing.
But The private sector also today knows that the Sustainable Development Goals is actually about achieving a more stable future, a more predictable environment, a more resilient market in which they can operate. So investing, in a sense, your private capital in a worthy investment while also contributing to impact on the Sustainable Development Goals is a win-win proposition, but we have to create the right conditions.
Lack of trust is also one of the biggest problems. There has been quite some amount of skepticism arising over the past few months about the Belt and Road Initiative, the idea itself. That is an interesting case study in a way, because the world does need a lot of fresh ideas. But on the other hand, people tend to be more skeptical about ideas rather than thinking solutions. As the UNDP, how do you read this phenomenon and adjust?
From a perspective of a United Nations Development Program, first of all, the commitment of China to engage in the development of other countries is to be welcomed, and the Belt and Road Initiative is a very significant financial commitment to supporting the development of particularly developing nations. And development is a complex process. It's not only a matter of putting money into a project. It is about learning lessons, about financing, about inclusiveness, about macroeconomic policies. And I think we are probably in a phase where, irrespective of some of the geopolitical debates, China itself is examining how can it learn lessons, how can it evolve its own Belt and Road Initiative. And here UNDP is one of the world's premier partners in helping countries look also at how their support to other countries can deliver maximum impact, maximum benefits. And I think if we understand these two as related but distinct tracks on the Belt and Road Initiative, it is easier also to understand what moment we are moving in.
Achim Steiner, the UNDP administrator. That is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.